Well, we're going to have a handout. I see a couple men that are going to help me hand these out. Yes, it's you, Jim, and yes, it's you, Brian, or Kyle. That's fine. Hey, Keelan, good to see you. Oh, my goodness. Hey, nice to meet you, Jim. I have an old friend here from Forest Park a lot of years back, so appreciate that. The handout, I learned decades ago. We were at Forest Park, and someone was speaking or leading a lesson. And when it was over, people were walking out, and there was a gentleman beside me. I didn't know who he was, but I heard him say to his wife, "I didn't get a thing out of that lesson. Got absolutely nothing out of that lesson." And I thought, what's the one way that won't happen to me? Give a handout, so at least they have something to walk out with, so they can't say they didn't get anything out of it. So hopefully that's not the only reason we have this handout, but I think it'll help us. We're going to talk about, our topic is Top God, and we know that the theme comes from Top Gun. Anybody remember the year that came out? Was anybody alive the year that came out besides me? 1986. Okay, 1986. How about Top Gun Maverick? When did that come out? 2022. Top Gun, 39 years ago. The star's still looking pretty good, isn't he, from what I see, unless it's a lot of makeup he's wearing. He's still holding up pretty good. Since it is Top Gun is where we got our theme from, we're going to open with a couple questions, and it's not on your sheet there. See what you remember. What was Maverick's Navy rank in the first and second movies? Anybody remember? This is Navy rank. If those of you in the military know that that's different from the Army, Air Force, and Marine Corps rank.
Lieutenant junior grade?
He was a first lieutenant. Had two bars.
2 bars is L3.
L3?
That's a lieutenant.
Okay, lieutenant. He was a lieutenant. And what was he in the second movie? Captain, that's right. Captain, exactly. Which is equivalent of what rank in the other services? Full bird? Colonel, that's right. Full bird colonel. What was Maverick's partner's call name in the first movie? Goose, that's right, Goose. Why wasn't he in the second movie? He got killed, didn't he? That's a good reason not to be there. What was Iceman's Navy rank in the second movie? A little higher. Vice Admiral. How many stars? 3 stars, that's right. He was a Vice Admiral. Remember his name? Real name? Val Kilmer. What do we know about Val Kilmer recently? He passed away, that's right, from throat cancer, which is what he had, I think, in the movie, which is a little ironic. What I want to open with is also not in your handout. Let's look at Galatians chapter 2, verse 14. Colossians chapter 2, verse 14. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. Having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. Now look at Galatians chapter 3, verse 24. So then the law was our guardian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. What are those 2 verses telling us? What is no longer in effect? The old law, isn't it? So why do we bother studying from the Old Testament? It was a schoolmaster. There is so much to learn from the Old Testament. Now, we're not under the Mosaic law, but there's so much that applies to today. And we're going to see that in this lesson today. And I know as I've been studying this over the last few weeks, everybody's generally familiar, I think, with the topic we're going to look at in 1 Kings chapter 18. But when you really delve into some of these, what happens? I remember Wayne Jackson, some of you know him. He's had written an awful lot of books and material over the years. He passed away a few years ago. But one of the things I remember him saying was about the scriptures, the deeper you dig, the richer the soil. And he applied that to scripture, especially the Old Testament. And that is certainly true. And as over the last couple of weeks when I've been studying these in chapter 18 in this Elijah and Ahab, and we'll talk about that as we get into it, is the more I studied it, the richer it became, the more applicable it became for us today, for Christians today. And hopefully we'll see that as we get started into it. The Bible account of this battle, and this was the battle between Yahweh and Baal. And we read about that. I'll go a couple times outside of chapter 18, but most of it will be in 1 Kings chapter 18. And that battle, which I think most of us are at least familiar with, the actual physical battle that they had between the two gods. But we want to be leading up to that. I want to give some background to this so we understand the situation that existed at that time in Israel and what brought this battle between Baal, the false god, and between Yahweh, the true God, and the outcome of that, and how that is applicable to us today, so that we can take what we saw then, apply it to our lives today, and how it can enrich us. And it certainly does, and like I think anything else we study in the Scriptures, the more you study it, the more applicable it becomes, and the more beneficial it becomes to all of us. And we'll talk about the background, then we'll talk about the battle itself, if you want to call it a battle, between the two gods and how they decided who was the true God and who was the false God. And then we'll look at some applications that, and if you come up with some, I came up with 4 or 5 that I thought about, and we'll get to those toward the end and what application we can make and how we can use that to strengthen ourselves and strengthen our faith. The Bible account of the battle between Baal and God took place during the reign of Ahab, who was what number king of Israel? 7th king of Israel. Northern kingdom of Israel, reigned for 22 years. He was morally weak and exceedingly what? Wicked. Exceedingly wicked. I'm not sure, he wasn't as wicked as his wife, but he was pretty wicked, okay? The extent of his evil was exceeded the total amount, this is what Scripture tells us, exceeded the total amount of the previous 6 kings who reigned before him. 1 Kings 16:30, now Ahab was the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all the kings before him. This was an evil guy. He eventually fell under the, you got a shadow there. He eventually fell under the influence of his wicked wife. What was her name? Jezebel. And supported her efforts to lead the nation to abandon their worship of Yahweh and embrace the worship of the false god Baal. His reign was marked by conflict with the prophet Elijah, prophet Elijah, who challenged the idolatry and wickedness of Ahab's kingdom. Elijah appeared on the scene rather abruptly. We don't have a lot of previous information about Elijah before he appeared on the scene, and boldly confronted King Ahab after conferring with the king's administrator, whose name was Obadiah. And there's some history between Elijah and Obadiah. They knew each other prior to this time, so they had some history there that they were friends, I guess you would say. Obadiah was a faithful follower of God, even though he was the administrator for King Ahab. Elijah foretold the coming of a 3-year drought as punishment for Ahab's false worship of Baal. Elijah fled Ahab, and he came to rest or to live for a while at the brook Cherith, Cherith, brook Cherith. In addition to the water from the stream, God provided what for him as far as nourishment goes? Bread and meat. Okay, bread and meat, right? How often? Twice a day. It was almost like in Uber Eats or Grubhub, wasn't it? Except the transportation was a little different, wasn't it? How'd they get the food? The ravens brought it to them. I'm not sure how sanitary that was, but I figured God's probably taking care of that. After the brook went dry, we know it was a 3-year drought, so eventually the brook that he was getting his water from went dry. And God sent Elijah to a starving widow and her child, where he provided them food and water in addition to doing what for her son? Healing the son who was sick. God then instructed Elijah to meet with Obadiah, the administrator, to the king, and tell him to inform the King Ahab Elijah wants to meet with him. If you look at 1 Kings 18:14, what was Obadiah's initial reaction to Elijah asking him to talk to the king and tell him that Elijah wanted to meet with the king? Well, I've got the Whitmire translation right here. I can picture him when Elijah asked Obadiah to talk to the king, tell him I want to meet with him. He said, "Are you crazy? He's going to kill me." He said, "You've been hiding for 3 years. If you hide again and I tell him you want to meet with him and then he can't find you, he's going to come back and kill me." But Obadiah had a second reaction to this in 1 Kings 18:15 and 16. He agreed to tell Ahab of Elijah's request for them to meet at Mount Carmel. Now the question is, why did he change his mind? Why did he go from, "No, I'm not going to do that, I'll get killed doing that," to agreeing to do it a short time later? Remember, Obadiah and Elijah had a previous relationship. They knew each other from the past. Obadiah trusted Elijah based on his knowledge of him and his personal experience with him. And I think there's a lesson here for all of us. Elijah gave his word to Obadiah that he would meet with Ahab that day. So all he had was Elijah's word that he would do what he said he was going to do. And Obadiah trusted him with his life. There's a truism here that I thought about. What can be said about a good reputation? If you've heard this truism, I call it. I think there's 3 things about a good reputation. It's hard to earn. What? It's easy to lose, and it's almost impossible to get it back. Think about that today. You know, some of us, and there's probably others in here besides me, that were not raised in the church. I was raised in a denomination, and it was 32 before I was converted. So I spent my youth and a good portion of my adult life outside the church, and basically outside the denominational church I was raised in. I went back last September from our 60th class reunion. But I moved out of town right after college, so those folks really didn't know much about me from early 20s to now. So when I go back to that, what's it called? Reunion. And what do they see when they see me? What do they remember? They remember the Jim Whitmire from high school and college. It's not easy to shake a bad reputation. I won't say bad, but worldly reputation before the church. I've never had success in converting any of my family members. And I think part of that reason is that they've known me through my earlier years. I didn't rob any banks or anything, but, you know, I was a worldly person. I didn't think there was much wrong with that at the time, but I look back now and I don't know who that person was back the first 30 years or so. But it certainly wasn't what it should have been. But that's what happens with reputations, isn't it? If you lose it, it's very difficult to get back. So why are good reputations so important to Christians?
They help you if you're trying to teach someone to be more a person whom they're willing to hear.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're trying to teach and influence people around us, should be all the time, shouldn't it? Every opportunity we have to influence people. And part of that is our reputation, what they see in us, and where we come from, and what our motives are for talking about Christ and the church. And so that's very important. That can be very helpful, and it can also be a drag on that if it's not the reputation that opens people's minds and hearts to the truth. So it's important about our reputations. We should always keep that in mind. When they met, Elijah told Ahab to bring how many prophets of Baal to Mount Carmel? 450, okay? And the prophets of Asherah, how many? 400. So we know this is going to end, this is going to climax at Mount Carmel. And so we've got 850 prophets that Ahab is bringing to this meeting at Mount Carmel with Elijah. And who else was coming to Mount Carmel? All of Israel. And I tried to find out, maybe if I looked a little deeper, but I couldn't find out a number for all of Israel. But I'm sure it was thousands and thousands of people. In addition to the 850 prophets of Baal and of false gods, prophets of false gods. So Elijah is setting up this confrontation or this battle. And who's going to be there? There's Elijah, and then 850 false prophets of a false god, and thousands of people who, from what I read, were, you might call them fence sitters. They had no problem worshiping Yahweh to keep Elijah happy, but they also had no problem worshiping Baal to keep Ahab happy. What would you call people like that today?
Religiously schizophrenic.
Schizophrenics, I guess, in a sense. We've heard the expression, there are people who have one foot in the church and one foot where? In the world, right? What do we call those kind of people? Weak, lukewarm,
Definitely not dedicated either way.
not dedicated either way. And Elijah's here by himself, and the more you read in these things, the more you kind of pull yourself into that situation back then. Elijah's by himself, and he said, yeah, I want all 850 to come. And I want all the thousands of Israel to come that could go either way. I thought of a term, not that I played a lot of poker, but what's the term is when a player shoves in all his money toward the center of the table? All in. Or crazy, I guess, but all in. I've seen it on TV. Now, I don't do that, but basically he's saying what? I'm putting everything on the line on this last hand. Wasn't that what Elijah was doing? I invited all the prophets, the king, and thousands of Israelites who could go either way. This is it. This battle is going to be it. If I lose, I'm gone. But Elijah said, I'm not losing. Okay? I'm not going to lose. So he had no problem doing that, setting that up because of his faith in God. One person. And it's interesting, in those passages it said, when Elijah described the terms of this battle about bringing down fire from above, and he went into detail about it, that, I don't want to jump ahead of myself here, but when Elijah explained the details of this battle, of what was going to happen, the people had an interesting response, at least in the English Standard Version. The people said that the terms were well spoken, at least the term in the English Standard Version, which is interesting. What do you think they meant by that? It was fair, yes. They believed that was fair. Remember, they were sitting on the fence, so the Israelites people were kind of in a win-win situation. If Elijah won, they said, fine, we'll just worship we'll worship Yahweh. But if Baal won, we'll just worship Baal. So they were okay with it. Let's talk about that. We'll get into the battle itself. This is from early morning to sometime at night, according to when they carried out some of their ceremonies. Elijah challenged Ahab to bring what? Two bulls. Bring 2 bulls, one for Elijah, one for Ahab. Choose one for themselves, referring to Ahab and his Baal worshipers. Cut it into pieces, lay it on the wood with no fire underneath it. Call their gods as he called the name of the Lord. Whoever answers by fire, he is God. All Israel answered and said, it is well spoken. A fair test, they would accept the outcome. The prophets of Baal and Asherah called on their gods from morning until noon. They allowed Elijah, said, you go first. And then at noon, if you want to look at 1 Kings 18:27, When the fire had not come down by noon, Elijah then mocked them with sarcasm.
Maybe he's asleep.
With sarcasm, didn't he? And I looked up the word sarcasm just to make sure I understood it. It usually means using the opposite of what is true to mock someone. 1 Kings 18:27. And this is Elijah talking to the prophets of Baal. And so it was at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, "Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is meditating, or he's busy, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's sleeping and must be awakened." He was openly mocking their God because he could not bring down fire. Does that seem strange to use sarcasm in a religious discussion? Why would Elijah have talked to the prophets and to Ahab in that manner?
He had absolute confidence. He knew that God is God.
Okay, he had absolute confidence.
But he had solid ground on which to stand.
Had solid ground. He absolutely believed in what he was saying, didn't he? He knew the truth. I don't know that he was necessarily trying to convince those 850 prophets as opposed to the thousands upon thousands of Israelites that were there. Those are the ones that are going to be left. He wanted Israel to follow Yahweh. And he was using that as a tool to make a point, to get their attention for that. You think of anywhere in the New Testament that there was sarcasm used like that to make a point? What sarcasm?
The sarcasm they made.
Oh, about him being on the cross?
When he said,
Okay.
they mocked him.
Okay. How about sarcasm to support Yahweh or God? I have to give credit to your speaker tomorrow night, John Burnett, for this one when I asked him if he knew of one. You criticize a speck in someone's eye, but you better do what? Get the plank out of your own eye. Isn't that a form of sarcasm? Because I don't think everybody's putting a 2x4 in their eye. So he was making isn't that somewhat of a sarcastic remark to make a point? You better get your own act together before you go criticizing other folks. Is that an example, do you think, that we should use today in defending our faith? Sarcasm? It was used in the Old Testament. I thought about that for a while.
Ephesians 4 says, speaking the truth in love,
So was it wrong for Elijah to use sarcasm here? I would say, yes, ma'am.
When we were coming up, there used to be a lot of debates in the brotherhood, and in those debates, those ministers then they would use sarcasm, so to speak, in comparison, especially when it came to the one name, the name defending using the Church of Christ, that there is something in the name. So that I think it depends on the situation and opportunity and how you go about it.
I think that's a very good point. The note I had was use it carefully. Be sure the situation is appropriate for that. But we have examples of that, don't we? So it may be if we have the time, I'll tell you of a situation that I was in with some denominational folks last fall, and they used sarcasm against me. So, but we'll see if we have time for that. Of course, keep in mind, Elijah's audience was whom? It wasn't just the prophets, was it? It was all of Israel. That's who he was looking to convince, because we'll see what happened to all the prophets, but he was really looking at the whole country of Israel.
He drew out total spelling of the situation for an entire commitment to position. And so this brought out the full commitment of position. There'd be no ambiguity left, so that when the event happened that he had prayed to God to happen, they would realize he had led into it with all that. He had been brave and bold because of the confidence he had in Almighty Yahweh.
Yes, I think that's a very strong point, that Elijah was very confident, not arrogant, but very confident in what he believed. Brian? Right.
Christ in Revelation 3, talking about the church being lukewarm, and spit you out, that if you're hot or cold, I'd rather you prefer than one or the other. You've made a decision. Here, these Israelites are just waiting for the winter and you'll follow whoever wins. And you don't ever win that way.
Well, you took my last 5 minutes of the lesson, Brian, so we'll get out a little early then. Yes, that's absolutely right. As I said, the Israelites at that point were ambivalent. They were fine either way. They just didn't care, okay? They weren't committed to one or the other. But that's who, obviously, Elijah, I think, realized that, and that's who he was talking to. He wasn't trying to convince the prophets, because we know what's going to happen with that shortly. They prophesied from midday to the time of the evening sacrifice, including cutting themselves with knives and lances. And what? How do we know? Now, this wasn't pricking a finger like we do to take a reading or something, was it? How do we know that? Because it said that what? Blood was gushing out of their bodies.
Don't we call that will worship?
Will worship? I don't know what you call it, but taking a lance or sword to yourself, in a sense, those prophets were committed, weren't they? They were committing suicide almost, trying to get that fire to come down from above to prove that their God, Baal, was the true God. I think about our Christians' commitments at times. What kind of commitment do we have in our lives? Not during the good times or the easy times, but the difficult times when we're tested. And I think almost all of us at one point or another in our lives or more are going to have those difficult times, and what it does to our faith, what's tested. Who knows that we're being tested? Satan knows, doesn't he? Satan knows when we're at our weakest point. What's he going to do? He's going to attack, isn't he? We know that. He crawls around like a what? A roaring lion, from whom he may devour. Why would God allow us to be in situations like that in our lives as faithful Christians?
Testing of our faith works endurance. Testing of our faith works
testing of our faith and endurance.
And afterward, it builds us toward being able to help someone else down the road who's having a weak time when we can relate what happened in positive.
Exactly. That gives us experience to speak from experience when folks go through that and are weakening in their faith. Many of us have been through that and come out the other side, can talk about that. What happens a few years later, most of the time, I know it has with me, when there have been very difficult times? Family, faith, health, finances. And we look back 3 or 4 years back then from now, and I know what I think. As bad as it was back then, I made it through, and I'm stronger for it. And I can relate to folks that are going through that may be a weakening of faith because of that. Why is God doing this to me? I'm a faithful Christian. So why is God allowing that to happen? Builds our faith, right? Strengthens us.
When you've been through a tough thing, you know the easier ones don't really matter so much. Things that used to look very bad to me don't carry much weight anymore.
I know we were in a class a couple years ago with members here, and one of the men in the class said, he said, I can honestly say I've never been through a trying time. And this was a middle-aged man, and he almost felt left out or guilty about that because he hadn't had the opportunity to be strengthened and tested. But life has a way of evening those things out, doesn't it? What else is the reason for that? The one I think about is God is preparing us to be in His presence in eternity. That's part of the preparation process of strengthening our faith to be in His presence. Elijah took 12 stones. Why 12? 12 tribes, right? 12 stones, built an altar, dug a trench around the altar, placed the pieces of the meat on the altar, filled it and the trench with water, and called upon his God to send down fire to destroy everything, which God did. Why did Elijah go to all that trouble to soak everything in water, to fill the trench up with water? What point was he making?
There was no way it could have been accomplished by man.
He wanted to make sure there was no doubt that you couldn't come up with an excuse for why that fire came down and burned it, and Baal could not do that. No ambiguity. No room to squirm in, is there? He then instructed the people to execute the 850 prophets beside the brook Kishon. I thought about that execution. So these thousands of Israelites had seen the fire come down. They accepted Yahweh, or said they would. They accepted Yahweh, and then Elijah says, destroy those 850 prophets. How would those thousands of people go about executing those 850 prophets at that time? It had to be bloody, didn't it? What else did they have? It said they went down to the brook Kishon. I guess it was convenient since everything would wash down the river and maybe you wouldn't have this bloody mess of 850 bodies separated down there in that mess. But that's how things were done back then, is they just eliminated those 850 prophets. And it was interesting when Elijah then instructed people to execute the 850 prophets beside the brook Kishon, and he went up to the top of Mount Carmel to do what? To pray. What do you think you try to put yourself in that situation, in that time. They had seen this fire come down from heaven, burn up that bull, and now they were told to execute 850 grown men with knives and lances and swords and whatever. Can you imagine the emotional situation during that? You would have thought there'd have been some type of celebration or just people going wild.
You want to get out of there.
But what did Elijah do? First thing, by himself, up on the mountain, Mount Carmel, to do what? Pray to God. For, I'm sure, leadership to guide him now that this had been destroyed. Ahab was not killed at that time. He was killed later in a battle, as we read, and we know what happened to his wife later on. She died a horrible death. So they got their due. But Elijah wasn't celebrating this victory for God. He was going straight to God and to pray for him, to pray, to thank him, I'm sure, ask for guidance on that. We think about the lessons we take today with that. All right, lessons for what our current battle with our false gods. And we know we have false gods today in different aspects. Very few of us will ever face the danger that Elijah faced. We have far greater promises and rewards for faithful service to our God than those following false gods. Let's look at James chapter 1, verses 2 to 7. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. We talked about why we get in these situations. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. We talked about why God allows us to be in these situations that tests our faith. This is what James is talking about here. It strengthens us. Yes, sir.
I was going to bring it up earlier. The people that were fence, sitters that you were speaking of, that reminds me of what James said, just the verse next to that, it says that you'll be a double-minded man. Your ways are unstable in all your ways. So that just jumped in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. So we understand we're going to be in those. But God has a purpose for that, doesn't it? What's he say about gold and silver? How is that refined? Through fire, isn't it? Through fire. What's the, is it analogy or metaphor, whatever that word is? Well, how does that apply to us as Christians? We're refined. Our character, our faithfulness is refined by difficult situations or fire.
Situation, the elements are separated.
The elements are separated when they refine gold and silver. That's exactly right. to burn off the impurities. Good point. Good point. So that serves a purpose. And I think if we keep that in mind while we go through these, I know we get caught up in those difficult times, don't we? And it kind of overwhelms us. And sometimes we're blinded by the purpose, or what the true purpose is that for God, and that He will be with us. Something for today, an application for today. Recognize the futility of creating idols and then expecting those man-made deities to act when we invoke their name. 1 Thessalonians 1:9. Paul wrote, "For they themselves declare concerning us what manner of entry we had to you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God." As we mentioned before, we certainly have idols today, don't we? False idols. It reminded me, and I was raised in a denominational church, and this was in my early teenage years, but I remember one Sunday morning, whoever was making the announcement said, we're going to have an additional time for worship at 8 a.m. on Sunday mornings. We're going to call it the golfers' worship service. Because they complained they couldn't make their tee times because of the 9 or 10 o'clock time for worship, so the leaders decided to have a shortened 8 o'clock golfer service. Well, at the time, I thought, well, that's a pretty good idea. Of course, I was 14. I look back on it now and I think, what? A slap in the face to God because of golf? No wonder I quit playing it a year or two ago. No, that's just because I can't play anymore. Number 3, dehumanizing effect of idol worship. The prophets of Baal were cutting themselves. We must be careful who and what we worship, because what we worship may end up devouring our souls. Ezekiel 22:4. You have become guilty by the blood which you have shed, and have defiled yourself with the idols which you have made. What are some of the idols we have today? False idols that can devour us. We could make a long list, couldn't we? Gambling, sports, alcohol, drugs, selfishness, on and on and on, that we don't realize we're being devoured. Number 4, Elijah's courage. Mark 15:43. An example in the New Testament. Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent council member, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God. I thought that was interesting, and I know I've read it a lot of times, but he was waiting for the kingdom of God coming. And reading that scripture, coming and taking courage, went into Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Why did it take courage to ask Pilate for the body of Jesus? Why did Joseph need courage to do that? He was a member of the Sanhedrin. He was in the upper echelon of the Jewish faith. Why did he need courage?
He would be showing himself to be a believer, to be interested in the body of Jesus, who had been crucified allegedly for blasphemy. So he's acting in a manner in the opposition of the events that had occurred. And so that's almost like a challenge to Pilate.
I think that's an excellent point.
Pilate was a Roman officer, and Joseph of Arimathea was a Jew. So you had to do what went on.
Right, he would have had to do it. But he found the courage to do it, didn't he? God's will for the plan for the eventual resurrection, right? We think about that.
Pilate went along to crucifixion because he didn't want Caesar to be upset.
Right, that's right.
He was answerable to Caesar for any insurrection or upset going on.
That's right. And the Jews knew that. And they played that against Pilate, didn't they, to get their way. And of course, he was self-serving, so he did go along to get along. But they got the body, and we know what happened. What do we do? Do we have situations today that we may or may not have the courage to stand up for what we believe? How do we react in those situations? Past, present, future? When maybe we're the only one and there's a large group or larger group.
I had a friend some years ago who was in his office at work, and on break time he would open his Bible, and if someone was interested, he would talk with them about it. And he was told not to do that. He was at a car dealership. They said you can't do that here. So he continued doing it, and he was fired. But he went on to get a better job, and he ended up okay. But he spoke out and stood up for what was right, and lost his job as a result.
We have situations where we're challenged, aren't we, in our faith? And that's where what rubber meets the road, when you really get tested, and you have to make a decision, don't you? Lastly, the importance of taking a stand. And the definition for that phrase, not faltering between two opinions. And thanks to Brian, I won't have to read this Revelations 3:16, but I'll read it anyhow. So then, because you, the church of the Laodiceans, we're talking about, are lukewarm, neither hot or cold, I will vomit you or spit you out of my mouth. How repulsive is that to us? So how serious is that, the sin of being lukewarm? And that's an easy situation to fall into, isn't it? Being lukewarm. So we don't have to stand out. But God expects us to do that. And He will guard us for that. Anybody have any other comments? I think we're almost right on 45 minutes, so Kyle won't yell at me. Okay? I appreciate everyone's attention tonight, and I guess we're going. Do we go downstairs next, or I'm not sure. Somebody will come in and tell us what to do, but that wraps up the lesson. I appreciate your attention tonight.